Welcome to California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We are coming to you from Sacramento, and we are joined by Dave Jones. He's the Insurance Commissioner for California. And so I want to speak with you about health insurance, not the Affordable Care Act yet, about rate regulation. We know that with regard to automobile insurance, we do have rate regulation under the office of the Insurance Commissioner, Prop 103. Do we have that with regard to health insurance?
No, we don't. It comes as a big surprise to many Californians. They know that the Insurance Commissioner regulates auto, homeowners, all property and casualty rates.
Right.
And in my term as Commissioner, we've saved consumers and businesses $1.4 billion, with a B, in premiums by using that authority to regulate those rates. But that authority does not extend to health insurance or HMO product, and it's really frustrating because that's where we're seeing the largest increases.
Now, the Affordable Care Act, does it provide any rate regulation?
No, it does not.
None?
No.
Not
no.
the federal government, not the states?
No. The only thing that state law provides is review of rates. So I review the rates, and I make a determination whether the rates are unreasonable, and in many cases we've concluded the rates are unreasonable, but that determination is not binding on the companies, and they're free to set the rates as they will, and they do.
But you've used the bully pulpit a few times, and you've convinced a variety of healthcare insurers to lower rates once they made a proposal. Is that true?
We have, and in some cases where we found the rates unreasonable, the companies have been agreeable to reduce the rate or the rate of increase. But what I found is in the last year, not so much.
Oh, really?
Increasingly, the companies are saying, look, Commissioner, we understand your determination, but it's not binding. We're going ahead as we see fit.
Even though more people are coming online, they're getting more customers as a result of the Affordable Care Act?
Yes.
Huh. So let's talk about an initiative that will be on the ballot in November. Do we know the number yet?
We don't.
Okay.
The number will be assigned in a couple
Fair
of
enough.
months, but what the ballot measure
Please.
does is it gives the determination of the Insurance Commissioner actual binding full force and
really?
effect. So it essentially extends the existing authority to regulate rates to health insurance and HMO products and requires the companies to justify their rates. That's critically important, to provide a public justification for their rates and to give a publicly accountable authority the ability to say, wait a minute, that rate's too high, you can't raise that rate that way.
So, sir, in 1988, when Prop 103 was on the ballot, which regulated insurance for automobile products and others, the insurance industry spent $63 million against.
That's right.
That was 1988. Are you ready in 2014 for an onslaught of money to come at you as the main proponent of this initiative?
We know that the health insurers and HMOs, the last thing in the world they want is to have to justify their rates, to be held publicly accountable. So yes, we anticipate they'll spend $60, $70 million attacking this ballot measure. But I'm also confident the voters have common sense, business owners and operators have common sense, they see the value of this and they'll support it.
At the same time, could one not argue that market forces should be allowed to operate, especially as we are now bringing the Affordable Care Act online? Everything will start to even out, so why get the government involved?
I wish it was the case that competition would result in lower rates, but we have essentially a monopoly position by the health insurers and HMOs, and that's true even with the Affordable Care Act. If you look at it, actually, we have fewer carriers now in the individual market after the Affordable Care Act than before. United and Aetna left the individual market entirely. So we're not getting more competition, we're getting less. We're getting a mandate that people buy the product, and so by law you have to buy their product. So now the carriers are even in a better position to jack up the rates, and that's what they're doing.
Do other states allow for regulation by insurance commissioners?
Yes, they do. We're behind the curve. 35 other states have given their commissioner this authority, so we're well behind the curve here in California.
Okay, when we come back, I want to talk more about health insurance, talk specifically about the Affordable Care Act, about Covered California. We're speaking with Dave Jones. He's the Insurance Commissioner for California. For our viewers on HLN, thanks so much for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back. So, sir, let's talk about Covered California. I think it's fair to say that Covered California is a bright spot for the Affordable Care Act. Covered California and Covered Kentucky. Who would have thought that Kentucky would be the other bright spot for supporters of the Affordable Care Act? But why is it that Covered California overall is a bright spot in the nation in terms of Obamacare?
So if you think about it, we've been working on this since at least 2005 in California when a Republican governor first presented the Affordable Care Act to the Democratic legislature.
Right. Schwarzenegger.
And so
Schwarzenegger.
that's right. And so we've had a long time to work on this, and I think that has given us the ability to better pull it off. And we have pulled it off. Now, that's not to say that there aren't challenges. Latino enrollment continues to lag. We've got to do a better job there. Youth enrollment, while we're doing better there, still room for improvement. There are a host of issues.
I'd like to talk to you.
But overall, we're doing very, very well. Over 825,000 people enrolled in the non-Medi-Cal portion, about that many people enrolled in the Medi-Cal portion. We're leading the nation, and it's good news because it means that over 1.5 million people will have health insurance that didn't have it before.
So let's talk about the Latino population. The early numbers were dismal. I mean, really, really dismal. Newer numbers, not as bad. It appears that about 20% of the enrollees are of Latino descent, which is only about 10% off of population averages. Why is it, though, that we've faced, in your mind, such challenges to bring Latinos online with Covered California?
I think the problems have been well reported. There was an issue with regard to the Spanish language application not being up on time. There were insufficient number of Spanish language interpreters available for people, on and on. And I think, to their credit, Covered California has publicly acknowledged these problems and has moved smartly to try to address them. I also give a lot of credit to Senator Norma Torres and the Latino Legislative Caucus for raising these issues as well.
Let's talk about the youth, because we know, not just in California, but nationwide, and when I say youth, I mean young adults, that if young, healthy adults do not register in sufficient numbers, that the entire system could start to implode on itself. It would create what we know as a death spiral, because you need the young and healthy to offset the older and infirm. The youth numbers early on were pretty low, getting a little better, but still not at the rate, the 40%, 35% that many would like to see. Not
at exactly the rate, but it's not lagging too far behind. And I think the good news is that there are a sufficient number of young people in the pool that the pool is not going to be defective in the sense of sharing risk. And so while there's more work to be done there, the good news is we have a viable risk pool, and one that I think will make sure that no carrier is suffering a disproportionate share of older, unhealthy, sicker people.
Now, many of the youth happen to be Latino, because of course we have a growing Latino population, but we also have the question of the undocumented. In the Affordable Care Act, it is impermissible to provide insurance products to the undocumented. The children of undocumented, if they're documented, can be covered, but not the undocumented. Ricardo Lara, state senator, he is looking to pass a bill that would allow California to use non-ACA dollars to cover the undocumented. What's your sense of that, sir?
I think it's important that we figure out a pathway not only for individuals who are undocumented to become documented and citizens of this great nation, because they're a huge part of our state and a huge part of our economy. And just as we were leaders in making sure that individuals can be licensed to drive, I think we've got to find a path to make sure they get health care coverage too. I think it's going to be a challenge, because in the event that they are afforded the opportunity to purchase through the health benefits exchange, the state has to pick up the cost of that. So I think those issues have to be worked out at a time when our budget continues to be under significant challenge. But the overall objective of making sure that we insure all Californians is one I share.
So that's the question, is now the time? We do have a surplus, but is California spending more money to cover the undocumented, because it is federal law that if someone shows up at a medical facility, they must be treated, than if they paid for insurance in the front end?
Well, the issue is all of us are paying for that, because when people show up in the emergency room, if they don't have insurance, that cost gets shifted to those of us that have insurance. So it's estimated that each of us pays $500 more in premium individually and $1,400 more in premium as a family because of the cost shift. So it benefits all of us to get everyone insured, and certainly the Affordable Care Act moves a long way in that direction. It just doesn't reach undocumented people. So the question is, how do we accomplish that? Because we'll all benefit from making sure everyone is insured.
Do you expect this bill to actually make it out?
I think that there's a lot of interest behind it. I think there's a lot of strong support for it. I think the question is, how exactly do we do it?
His name is Dave Jones. He's Insurance Commissioner for California. My name is Brad Pomerance. We'll be right back on California Edition.
What percentage of enrollees in Covered California have been deemed eligible for a subsidy under the Affordable Care Act? 50%, 65%, 77%, or 85%? About 85% of people signing up for coverage through Covered California are eligible for a government subsidy that lowers premium costs.
Welcome back to California Edition. My name is Brad Pomerance, and we are joined by Senator Bill Monning from our Sacramento Bureau, by the way. And I want to speak with you, sir, about those sugary sweetened drinks that we all love so very much, but maybe we shouldn't love them that much.
Right. Well, so I've introduced legislation, SB 1000, that would require a warning label to inform consumers that all the scientific data demonstrates that consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages does contribute to obesity, preventable diabetes, and tooth decay. So this is irrefutable science. It's not a politician saying it. It's doctors and researchers.
But let's back up for a second, if we may, and talk about the delivery of sugar. Because, look, a lot of products have manufactured processed sugar.
Right.
So what is it about sugary drinks that draws the ire, whereas cookies or cake or whatever?
Well, it's a great question because, as you can imagine, the sugar-sweetened beverage industry says, why are you picking on us? And as you say, Brad, there's sugar in other products. The big distinction, the increased calories in sugar-sweetened beverages, they're non-nutritional calories. And because it's in liquid form, it goes more rapidly to make the liver work overtime, the pancreas work overtime, and it converts that sugar to fat more rapidly than food that may contain sugar, but which is digested through a normal digestion process.
And I'm sure you know, I have friends, I mean, they could drink just can after can after can of these sugar pop soda.
Right. Well, we're the first to acknowledge there's no single fix, but what we do know, there is an obesity epidemic in this state and this nation. And it's a combination of factors, lack of exercise, et cetera. But the science shows clearly that the leading cause of increased calories, or the leading source, sugar-sweetened beverages. So, and non-nutritional, causing this damage. And people say, well, you know, families should take responsibility. This is nanny government. Well, we're not on a level playing field. The industry spends literally hundreds of millions targeting young people. Some in lower income communities live in food deserts. And now the liter bottle may be priced less expensively than an equivalent amount of milk or water.
I'm sure you heard that in New York there was an attempt to, I guess, ban the big gulp. That was struck down. You're not looking to ban anything here.
No.
It's a warning label.
It's a warning label. We say consumer right to know. If consumers are going to purchase these products, let's put what's known, good science. Let's provide that warning label. We did it with tobacco.
And let me ask you about tobacco. Do we feel as if, what have the studies indicated about the effectiveness of the tobacco labels, which have gotten scarier through the decades?
That's right. Clearly, as a public health strategy, the warning label on tobacco has been effective, combined with higher taxes on the product as well. So it's kind of a public health strategy, and we are using the efficacy of that in tobacco, certain alcohol products, notifying women, pregnant women. So we're saying, let's just give the consuming public the right to know that these risks are associated with the consumption.
Do we not know? What do you think? Do we not know?
That's a great question because the industry is saying to us, well, everybody knows that you shouldn't drink this in excess. And yet, when we talk to people and polling shows, most people don't know that the 20 fluid ounce bottle of pop has the equivalent of 16 teaspoons of sugar in it, twice the recommended daily allowance of sugar consumption for your entire day. That's the federal
When
FDA.
we come back, I want to ask you about diet drinks.
Sure.
We may talk about the drought. We're speaking with Senator Bill Monning. For our viewers on HLN, thank you so much for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back. So, sir, let me ask you about diet drinks, because I think a lot of us, myself included, feel as if, okay, if I'm craving the carbonation, I'll have a diet drink. Doesn't have the sugar, may have a little caffeine. But I've heard folks say that the diet drinks are equally as troubling in terms of health consequences.
Well, our legislation goes just to the sugar-sweetened beverages, and we have a threshold of 75 calories or more. So my bill in the warning does not go to diet drinks. That said, we're not necessarily endorsing diet drinks. There are studies going on. I've heard some of what you've read, less conclusive at this point. We encourage water's the most healthful drink out there. My bill also doesn't go after natural juices.
Yeah, what about fruit sugars? I mean, fruit sugars are a lot of sugar. I mean,
That's
there's no
right.
doubt. Orange juice?
Again, if sugar is added, the warning label would cover it. We don't go after natural juices. But it is a public health crisis that we're facing. The warning label is designed to provide that consumer right to know, and also to provoke a very important public conversation that families who maybe don't know the damage that's being done by these products will make a more informed choice.
I want to ask about the ability for the state to mandate this, because as I recall, with tobacco, that was a federal mandate.
Right.
So can one of the 50 states so mandate?
Great question. So one of the legal issues that we have researched, a state can use warning labels consistent with FDA criteria and requirements. So we absolutely have the right to do that. We can go above current federal labeling. Where there's federal label required, a state can't opt out.
Cannot opt out.
So the feds create a foundation or a floor. In California, if this becomes law, we would be the first state to require the warning label on sugar-sweetened beverages. We do it on containers, bottles, cans, liter bottles, also at dispensing machines at a restaurant or a corner store.
How will that work for industry? Because look, our 50 states, the borders are porous. You know, in California, we may not live near borders, but you think about other areas. And
well, states have grappled with this, and more importantly, manufacturers have. We have bottling companies and distributors throughout California. They routinely change their labels for holidays, seasonal labeling, etc. We think it would be a minimal burden on the industry. For the people at the retail level, they put up that warning label once on their dispenser. It's a one-time action. It would be enforced by local health officials who routinely visit restaurants and any stores that are serving food.
I know I said I wanted to talk to you about the drought, but if we can we talk about the Affordable Care Act?
Sure.
You're chair of Senate Health, right? Or
no,
you were chair of Assembly Health.
And I sit on Senate Health.
So I want to get a sense from you, how is the Affordable Care Act rolling out in your district, which takes up a huge geographic part of the state?
Well, I do have a huge district, very diverse in resources and people. I think overall the report card is still out, but the good news is that we're seeing the state is enrolling people who have not been enrolled. And so one of the big objectives of the ACA is to get coverage for people who didn't used to have coverage because of cost prohibition, pre-existing health condition. We're seeing literally over 1 million people, close to 1 million people in California newly enrolled. So that's the good news.
What about in your rural areas? Because that's where so often healthcare can be lacking, and the need for insurance or the desire for insurance can wane.
Yeah, well, quite honestly, the area that I represent, the biggest workforce, agriculture, hospitality, tourism, immigrant workers, not necessarily eligible if they're undocumented. To enroll under the ACA. So from a public health point of view, this presents a challenge because we want the benefits of comprehensive prevention, immunization, etc. That inures to the benefit of the entire community.
Well, I'm sure you know one of your colleagues, Senator Ricardo Lara, has proposed a bill that would allow the undocumented to access a version, not through the ACA. But back to Latinos, if I may, the immigrant population. The numbers are looking a little better, I've read, that they're signing up for Covered California more than they were in the early days, but still a little behind the curve. What's your sense in your area?
I don't know the exact data. What I do know, you point, Brad, to one of the challenges is that sometimes non-English speaking population don't always pick up a phone and dial a 1-800 number, and that's why we have in place what we call navigators, people working at the community level who are bilingual, who are culturally attuned, and who can assist with helping people get enrolled. So it's labor intensive. There have been enrollment clinics throughout the state.
His name is Bill Monning. He's a member of the California State Senate. My name is Brad Pomerance. We thank you so much for watching California Edition.
How long does it take for the typical adult to burn off the calories consumed from a 12-ounce can of soda? 12, 21, 27, or 43 minutes. A typical adult needs 27 minutes of brisk walking to burn off the calories in a single 12-ounce can of soda.
Welcome to Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance, and we are joined by Ed Hernandez. He is a member of the California State Senate. And sir, you are taking a very, very bold step. As we know, the voters in the 1990s, I believe, passed Proposition 209, which banned the use of race, gender, color, creed in really any decision by a public entity, including education, including employment. What we know is that since Prop 209, enrollment figures in our public universities have been quite low when we look at communities of color. You're looking to change that.
Yes.
Talk to us about SCA 5.
Well, what it's going to do is if it gets out of the assembly, it will go to the people to ask that question again, to see if they're willing to address that issue, to allow the universities of the state to use race as a factor.
And gender.
And gender.
So let's be as specific as possible and talk about the history of what has happened with this constitutional amendment, its proposal. It's been through various houses at various times over the last few years. This year, this cycle, the Senate did pass it out with a 2/3 vote.
Correct.
That's a tremendous margin, and to get it out was quite an accomplishment for you. It's now going to the Assembly, and if the Assembly votes it out with 2/3, it goes back to the voters.
Correct.
It doesn't need to go to the governor.
That is correct.
The Democrats do hold a 2/3 majority in both houses, and presumably you might be able to get it passed out of the Assembly. What do you see?
Well, I'm not taking it for granted. Even though there is a 2/3 majority, I believe it's still going to be a controversial issue, and I need to lobby each one of the members so that they understand the merits of the measure.
And there's no question, sir, that this measure is so charged on so many levels. Whenever you talk about race, there is a general feeling of fear. I mean, people are almost afraid to have the conversation.
I agree.
And so, intuitively, many of us believe we should just be judged by the hard, cold numbers. Why do you believe that maybe that's not the whole story?
Well, you're right. Anytime we deal or discuss race, it gets blown out of proportion. But here's the reason why. Since Proposition 209 was passed, there was a huge precipitous drop of underrepresented minorities that were accepted to the UC systems.
And what's interesting, if I may, sir, is that some folks may not realize the community that saw the largest drop was not the Latino community, it was the African American community. Those numbers just plummeted way below their proportion of the population.
Correct. But the other thing that's interesting is if you look at our university system, the master plan that was set up throughout the state of California specifically says that it must reflect the diversity of the state of California. The diversity of the state of California in the 50s and the 60s looks a lot different than it looks today.
Well, and if you look at our public institutions today, we see disproportionate numbers of Asian Americans on college campuses, not in proportion to their representation in the population of California. And so that gives us even more stomach aches, because how do we deal with that? I mean, that's a underrepresented group vis-a-vis the European population, but why are they able to be admitted at such high levels?
Well, but it's not all just, there's other forms of Asians that are underrepresented, the Hmongs, the Filipinos. So what I'm saying is what we need to do is to allow the universities to go after the best and the brightest of all segments of our population, and to use race as a factor, not as,
the U.S. Supreme Court has been they've issued several rulings on this. And as we speak today, what we know is the Supreme Court has said that institutions can consider race as a factor. It has not been outlawed entirely, although some wonder whether this court will outlaw the consideration of race as a factor. But at the same time, where do we go with the fundamental question of how to consider race as a factor?
Well, as you mentioned, the courts have ruled that you can consider, albeit in a narrow margin, which means that you cannot have quotas, You cannot have preferential treatment. But what you can do is use it in the form of recruiting to go after the best and the brightest. Because we're losing those kids to the private schools. They're going away.
They're allowed to use race as a factor.
Yeah, so there's a huge disadvantage that the UCs have. And there's an even bigger disparity amongst the flagship schools like UC Berkeley and UCLA. Because don't we want the best and the brightest to come? And I'm not saying to allow somebody to come in that is not qualified. That is not what I'm asking, and that's not what I'm proposing. What I'm saying is to allow the UCs to go after the best and the brightest kids of color, bring them in to assimilate, because diversity only makes our state better.
At the same time, a lot of what we're dealing with may not be ethnicity, but socioeconomic
Correct.
status. And so it begs the question, and I'd love to hear your response, is diversity for diversity's sake a valuable element on a campus? I mean, do we want the rich ethnic kid to be part of this type of program when that rich ethnic kid received as many attributes and preferences as the European kid?
We need to have a cadre of diversity, from the rich ethnic kid to the poor ethnic kid who's just as bright or has the same capacity to achieve, because it makes us a richer society. If you look at California, how it is now compared to the 50s, we look a lot different, we act a lot different, and the country is moving in that direction. And we need to learn to make sure that our higher educational systems assimilate in that very same situation.
But let me ask you though about, let's just say for argument's sake this passes. What I have perceived is the issue is not ethnicity, it's not intelligence, it's access to information. It's so many of these kids just don't know, and more importantly, their parents don't know how to play the college admissions game. So you can pass this 100 times over, but without the relevant information trickling down to the parents and the ethnic child, whatever that may mean, it won't matter.
Yes, it will, because it will allow the UCs to educate the parent, to educate the student. Because right now, I'll give you an example. Let's say a community college, CSU, or the UC system wanted to do a STEM recruitment program for women to make sure you have more women that are doing math and sciences. They cannot do that under Proposition 209. If this were to pass, and if the voters allow it, then the UCs can say, okay, let's now go into these communities of color and talk to the counselors. Let's talk to the parents, and let's talk to them about recruiting their children to come to UCLA, to UC Berkeley, encouraging them.
I want to ask you about the politics of this. When I think about Proposition 187, when I think about Proposition 209, those were not fun times.
No, I agree.
I mean, it was really ugly. A lot of angst on both sides of the issue. If this goes to the ballot, we could see that again.
I agree. But, here's my thought. If I'm going to be elected and give my time to the public, I have to be willing to ask the tough questions, even if it's a controversial issue. And if the voters say no, I'll understand. But I truly believe that we need to be able to ask that question, and the electorate now is a lot different than it was back when it was passed.
What do you think the voters are going to say?
I think the voters will change their mind, and
it is California.
Yeah.
This is a blue state.
I think the voters will change their mind because of the makeup of who we are. If they look at the issue the way it really should be looked at, I think it's time to have that discussion. Let's have that discussion publicly. I'm willing to have it.
Okay, so we have to see what happens in the California State Assembly. It needs to get out of the Assembly by 2/3, and then it could come to the voters. Could it be in November?
Well, it depends. If I get a vote out of the Assembly before, I think it's the end of June, then it goes in this 2014 election.
Wow.
If it goes after July 1st or 2nd, then it goes in the 2016 election.
I'm Brad Pomerance, it's Charter California Edition.